Well, good afternoon, everybody here in the UK, and good morning to our friends in the US and all around the world. It's a real pleasure to welcome everybody to today's Aerobility Inspire-Ability talk, our project to try and keep everybody connected, inspired through these very testing times, through the magic of aviation and aerospace. And today, I think it's really fitting that we got such a space launch focused weekend. Obviously, with the launch of Crew Dragon and Falcon 9 yesterday, and to talk to somebody that's been so embedded in the history of space and launching vehicles in the US. What an amazing talk we're going to have today. But before I hand you over to John, our fabulous host, John Windover, just to remind you guys that Aerobility is a charity that supports thousands of disabled people every year. And we've got to try and fight to survive during these really testing times. So during the talk, I'm going to put a link up on the screen, which is where you can make a small donation just to keep this project alive. So thank you for your interest today, and we look forward to a fabulous session. So let me bring John onto screen now. John, good afternoon. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Mike. Thanks. What an awesome bit of TV that was yesterday. I assume you watched the launch.
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't have missed it. That was real history in the making.
Yeah, it really was. And I'm of the Space Shuttle generation, 1981, the first flight of the shuttle, and I've kind of grown up with that. But I've never had the opportunity to watch a live launch. I do have friends who have, and they just say it was absolutely spectacular. And I've been drawn to the Kennedy Space Center Visitors Center on a number of occasions, and it's just an awe-inspiring experience. And you've been there a few times, right?
Yeah, likewise. I was lucky. My parents took me and my brother over there in the 1980s. Really, that sort of started my passion for all things space-orientated and aerospace. And yeah, been a few times since. And a few years ago, it was great to see an actual launch. I saw the launch of the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, and that was really fabulous. Unfortunately, I never saw a shuttle launch, but maybe we'll get very close today, hearing about it from the horse's mouth.
No, absolutely, Mike. Well, look, without further ado, as Mike has alluded to, this is the one we've been waiting for. This is a really special talk today, and I'm very honoured to introduce our guest today, Mike Leinbach, who has spent his entire career at NASA. And Mike now joins us from Florida. How are you doing, Mike?
Good, John. Thank you very much. And Mike, good morning to you guys from sunny Florida.
Well, I think we got some of your weather, Mike. We've had apparently the sunniest spring on record. So we're enjoying some Florida sun over here in the UK today. Mike, you and I met, I think it was in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, at one of your tours you conducted at the Kennedy Space Center, right?
Well, that's exactly right, John. And, from the very beginning, when we first met, we struck up a quick friendship. And it was obvious you have your heart in space and flying and aeronautics, and so do I. So we hit it off right from the very beginning. And then when you started describing your charity, Aerobility, it is just a wonderful organization that I fell in love with over here in the States. And so anything I can do for you guys, I'm pleased to do it. And hopefully this will turn out good today, and maybe we'll do something else in the future, because your organization truly is inspiring to so many people that need a little bit of a boost. So it's my honor to be with you today.
Well, that's kind words, Mike. Thank you very much. And as the name suggests, these Inspire-Ability talks are a way of us all, having an opportunity to talk about aviation and aerospace. But unusually today we have space flight. Now, of course, intrinsically linked, perhaps beyond the preserve of about 99.9% of us aviators. And we're going to get an amazing insight, Mike, from you today. I've got your bio in front of me, Mike, and I'm just going to let the viewers understand your background. And the word inspiration to me is who you are for us today, Mike. Your career is absolutely exceptional with NASA. You have a bachelor's degree in architecture and a master's in civil engineering, specializing in structural dynamics. And you joined NASA in 1984 as a structural engineer, leading many design teams for various launch pad systems. But then you moved into the operational side of NASA post-Challenger in the late 1980s. And in 1988, you assumed responsibility for directing daily operations at the Kennedy Space Center Launch Complex. And then in 1991, moved up to Shuttle Test Director, which is a fascinating role that I've been doing some research on. And your responsibilities, amongst other things, were for all testing of the orbiter, the external tank, the solid rocket boosters, and of course, including all of the ground support and overall personnel safety throughout that countdown. On promotion up to 1998 and across to 2000, you were Deputy Director of the International Space Station Hardware Integration at Kennedy Space Center. And of course, we wouldn't have a space station without the shuttle program. So we'll be very interested to hear about that. And then in 2000, you assumed your final position with NASA as the Shuttle Launch Director, having an illustrious 11 years all the way up until STS-135, which was the final shuttle launch. And I believe you were the 8th and final launch director, having overseen 37 missions, and you were responsible overall for the shuttle launch countdown policy, planning and execution of all launches, and indeed gave the go, no-go for launch. I'd like to briefly, Mike, just let the viewers know about your work in 2003. We'll look at this in more detail a bit later, but we all saw the tragic scenes in 2003 following the breakup of Columbia on re-entry, and you led the initial debris recovery team and also the reconstruction team at Kennedy Space Center to try and find out the cause of that tragedy. And in 2015, you teamed up with author Jonathan Ward to tell that story and to try and emphasize the fact that it was a huge effort, to get to the bottom of that, of the cause of that accident, and to celebrate the collective efforts of thousands of people, everybody from NASA executives to individual citizens across the state of Texas. But finally, perhaps that word inspiration is very true. When I look at the awards you've received, Mike, in your career, you've received the NASA Exceptional Service Medal, the NASA Medal for Outstanding Leadership, and perhaps your most prized possession is the Presidential Rank Award presented by the President of the United States for exceptional long-term accomplishments. So what a career. We've said to our past guests, to see your career flash before your eyes in a few minutes there, but what a fascinating insight we're all looking forward to from your time at NASA. But what I'd like to start with is a video that will give everybody a little bit of perspective and to also have a chance to see some of those memorable scenes from the shuttle program. So Mike, if you could roll VT.
OTCT, Hillary complete. Copy. OTCT, LT, start is complete.
let's go for auto sequence start.
It's launch day at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The space shuttle is on the launch pad, the astronauts are aboard, and the countdown is clicking steadily backwards. More than 200 miles above Earth, the International Space Station is moving quickly through its 91-minute-long orbit, leaving the shuttle a scant 5-minute window to lift off or risk missing the orbiting laboratory. Inside the Launch Control Center, a cadre of some 200 launch controllers, all of them specialists in the shuttle and its myriad systems, methodically move through their own checklist to make sure that everything is ready. They work for days to bring the countdown this far, to a point 9 minutes before launch, when it's time to decide whether the shuttle is indeed ready to launch. The person making that decision is the launch director.
22,000 parameters roughly have to be exactly right in order to launch the shuttle.
If conditions aren't right, the launch director can scrub the launch attempt.
Okay, Zambo, well, you heard all that. We tried really hard to work the weather. It was just too dynamic.
We got feeling good there at one point, and then it filled back in, and we just were not comfortable with launching the space shuttle tonight. So we're going to go into a 24-hour scrub. Thank you all for the effort you all put in tonight. We'll see you back again tomorrow night, and we hope the weather's a little bit better.
Sometimes a problem isn't seen until the last seconds of a countdown, and the computerized ground launch sequencer aborts the launch.
It's running. 3, 2, 1, and have the main engine cut off.
GLS safing is in progress.
GLS safing is in progress.
Path 101, DSS loaded to 102, LED shows 1. Airfield coverage. GLS fire detector status. The MBS fire detectors work shift, and our primary safety is...
10 people have served as launch director during the Space Shuttle's 30 years of flying into space. For each, launch day became the ultimate test of their skills and decision-making.
The essence of the job is actually to say no when everybody else wants to go.
On launch day, the launch director and his team can be found in one of the firing rooms inside the Launch Control Center at Kennedy. He sits in the back row, facing a few monitors, and with the giant windows looking out to the pad at his back. Because his console is on a riser, he can look out on the other controllers in the room, many of them at specialized consoles behind horseshoe-shaped cabinets.
We have to be convinced as a team, I have to be convinced as a person, that everything is ready to go. And so until that point, until I have the feeling in my gut that we're ready to launch, we can meet every requirement we have on the books, but we also have to meet that gut check that says we're ready to fly that day. 9
minutes before liftoff, the flight control team in Houston, NASA and contractor management and the other members of the launch team radio a simple go or no-go.
Mila. Mila's go. STM. STM is go. Safety console. Safety console is go. STE. STE is go. LRD. LRD is go. SRO. SRO is no-go.
Then the launch director gets the last word in a tradition that goes back to the first launch of a space shuttle in 1981, when launch director George Page radioed to Columbia Commander John Young and pilot Bob Crippen.
John, we can't do more from the launch team than say we sure wish you an awful lot of luck. We're with you 1,000%, and we're awful proud to have been a part of it. Good luck, John.
Trip and I are mighty proud to work with you fellas. You're absolutely professional. The best there is.
That becomes very personal. And I look out to the pad and I think about the crew on board, and I have a little moment of reflection. And then the countdown clock picks up at T-minus 9 minutes.
There were 2 space shuttle missions that took the launch directors into untested areas. The first, STS-51L in 1986, was the Challenger accident. James Thomas was the launch director, and Seek was on hand on that cold January morning.
It was one of those days in hindsight when, even though everything was within specification as far as the launch commit criteria, the requirements were, a lot of people had this gut feeling that this just doesn't feel right.
NASA rebounded from the Challenger accident with determination, and the agency sought to fix its errors.
Our resolve was we're going to safely fly again. It's going to be a lot of work, but we're going to get there, and we did.
Discovery returned astronauts to space in September 1988, a mission Seek said gave a huge boost to the launch team.
The start, in this case, or the rebirth of the shuttle program, because the mission, the flight, its performance proved that we had fixed all of those items that we should have fixed in the Challenger.
In 2003, Leinbach was called into recovery service after Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry over Texas and Louisiana.
My job as the Rapid Response Team Chairman, it's another assignment of the launch director, is to take that first team from KSC to wherever the contingency is.
3 engines up and burning. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff of Space Shuttle Discovery, beginning America's new journey to the moon, Mars, and beyond. And the vehicle has cleared the tower. The shuttle returned to space again in 2005, with Discovery launching to the International Space Station. Launch days throughout the shuttle's illustrious program have always been special for the men and women in the Launch Control Center.
It's what we do. It is. We are launching America's space shuttle for the good of the country and the good of the world. It's what we do. We have to do this.
Fantastic. What I'm sure some very nice memories, Mike, flooding back for you there. I thought I would start today's discussions about, your formative years at NASA, because of course, being a structural engineer, there was a lot of work you were doing on the non-operational side. Can you give us some insights, into your first few months in the job? How did you get into NASA?
Well, John, I'll be glad to do that. But if I may, could I reflect on that video just for a moment?
Absolutely.
The memories came flooding back to me, and all good memories, with the exception of the tragedy of Columbia. But seeing Bob Seek on the video, he was my mentor. He was launch director when I was assistant launch director. He showed me the ropes through that job, and selected me for that position. And we're both from the University of Virginia, so that's an interesting tie there between us. But to see that video, it just brings back all those memories of a 30-year-long shuttle program that ended almost 10 years ago. So I thank you for showing it. It was a great video, and it does capture the role of the launch director pretty well.
Yeah.
To your question about how I got where I was, gosh, I was an engineer up in Lynchburg, Virginia, working for a nuclear power design office, and but had always been interested in space and space travel. So I applied to NASA for a job, and after several months, I got the position at the Kennedy Space Center as a launch pad structural engineer. And so my wife Charlotte and I came down here, never having been to Florida, but we came down here and set up shop, and the rest is kind of history. But I started out working on launch pad structural designs back in the early days of the shuttle program. We had 2 launch pads for shuttle. They were the old launch pads for the Apollo program that were modified for the Space Shuttle program. And when I hired in, the second of our 2 pads wasn't ready to fly yet. And so my principal job was to help get Launch Complex 39B ready to accept the shuttle. And in fact, the Challenger accident was the first flight off of Pad B. And so that brought back a lot of memories as well. But then I made my way up through the ranks and met the folks out in the operations organization, working on a project on the launch pad when I was designing the emergency egress system, which was a system to help the astronauts get off of the pad in a hurry if there was a fire or an imminent explosion or something like that. We had a system where the astronauts could get out of the orbiter and across the tower and down inside of a concrete bunker. That was one of my design jobs, and so I met the people in operations in the process of doing that, and they ended up hiring me as a NASA test director, overseeing the daily operations for the space shuttle fleet at the Kennedy Space Center. So that, in a nutshell, that's how I got into operations, and darn glad I did.
Yeah, absolutely. The sharp end, many would say. And we heard one of your predecessors there on that video clip say, your job was not to launch the shuttle. So give us explain that for us.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, and it's one that grew out of the formation of the launch director position with NASA back in the early days of America's manned spaceflight programs. Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Those programs were really the formative years, and a lot of the position descriptions and processes that carried all the way through the shuttle program really were born back in those early programs, and the launch director was certainly one of those. And it's a position in the control room of ultimate authority and responsibility. Yes, the launch director has the final go no go for all shuttle launches, all all rocket launches for NASA. But the principal function is to not launch that shuttle, because you need to be fully safe and secure, and you need to be sure in your decision before you press that button, figuratively press that button. And so the launch director doesn't have a heck of a lot to do on launch day other than be the leader of the team and make that final decision. But we would watch the team perform, make sure they were meeting all their technical criteria. A phenomenon takes over, John, in the control room. It's called launch fever, and it's a feeling that comes over the launch team where you're here for launch day. It's sort of like a game day of a major sporting event. You practiced so long and so hard, and now you're in the championship game. So it's game day for the space shuttle, and so a feeling can overcome the team and really want to launch and maybe cut corners, maybe hurry through a problem, that type of thing. The astronauts are in town, they're inside the space shuttle, TV cameras are rolling, and all that good stuff. So a feeling comes over the team of, hey, I think we're good enough today to launch. Well, that is not what you do, and you have to be fully good to go. And so it's the job of the launch director to make sure that everything is ready to go. Be the guy who stands up and says, no, we're not going to fly today, in the face of everyone else being go, and just stick to your guns that you do not fly until you're ready. And as the video said, I always base my final decision, and Bob Seek and the other launch directors did too, by thinking about the astronauts inside that vehicle, and are we ready to send them on the most dangerous thing they've ever done in their lives? These astronauts are real people. They have kids, they have mothers and fathers and mortgages and whatever the case may be. These are real people. Mm-hmm. And so I owe it to them to do that final gut check and ask myself, have we done everything we can today? And if the answer is no, then we scrub. If the answer is yes, and my gut feels good, then we'll press on and launch. And so it's the job of the launch director to be the bad guy, as it were, on mm-hmm. launch day, to say no in the face of everyone else being go. But in a case like that, we would not launch, and my 7 friends would be safe and sound, and we'd come back and try it another day.
Yeah. Now, as we said earlier, you and I met when I was on one of your tours and had the opportunity to go to the Launch Control Center into Firing Room 4, hallowed ground, and I got a sense of the scale of the operation to launch a shuttle. Can you give us a bit of an insight into those parameters you talked about? Who's down there? How does it all come together how does that information come to you? And what is the scale and scope of all those guys and girls monitoring those parameters on the consoles?
Yeah, that's great. And launch day is the culmination of about 4 or 5 months worth of working on a particular shuttle to get it ready to fly. Thousands of people and tens of thousands of man hours to get ready, to get the vehicle tested and inspected and ready to fly in the 4 or 5 months leading up to launch. But on launch day, the launch team is about 200 people, 180 to 200 people. We had to meet 22,000 technical parameters, had to be correct to launch the shuttle. So what we did, we subdivided down all those technical parameters by major piece of hardware. And so the orbiter itself, maybe of those 22,000 parameters, maybe the orbiter had 6,000. I don't remember the exact number, but you subdivide it down by major piece of hardware, and then you subdivide it down again by system engineer. So of the orbiter's 6,000 parameters, for instance, maybe electric power and distribution had 800 of them. And so then those engineers would be responsible for monitoring 800 electric power and distribution parameters, all the voltages and currents and amps, everything inside the vehicle and on the ground. And so you subdivide it down to make that 22,000 manageable. They would report up through test conductors per those major pieces of hardware, an orbiter test conductor, for instance, and a solid rocket booster test conductor, ground systems test conductor. So they would report up through those test conductors to the test director, a position I had held for a number of launches. It was sort of the orchestra leader, and the test director then would make sure everybody's in sync and make sure all the problems were resolved to the satisfaction of everyone, including the launch director. And then we would do the poll at T-minus 9 minutes. It would come across the headsets. It's always very quiet in the control room. People would give their go or no go, and then it would come up to me for that final gut check decision. So it was a very structured process, hierarchical, and that the engineers would report up through a test conductor to the test director, and then ultimately the launch director. And that was all the documented parameters, the 22,000 parameters. We also had a team that was responsible to think about other reasons why we should not fly that day. And that was born out of the Challenger accident back in 1986, where engineers the night before, we'll get into this a little bit more later, but there are undocumented reasons not to fly. For instance, it was too cold. Well, we met all the criteria, but as Bob Seek on the video said, there was a gut feel that maybe it was too cold that day, and maybe they should have stood down. So there's another team called the mission management team that rules on undocumented reasons not to fly, and then I get that input as well. And so I have to be go for 22,000 documented reasons, and then the go from the mission management team on undocumented reasons not to fly, and then I make my final decision.
So, I mean, clearly, the scale of parameters means it has to be a team effort, but ultimately, the role you had was that person that gave the final decision. So give us a sense of what it felt like. It's all come to this head. We're minutes away, and you've got all the information in front of you. Of course, there's a subjective side which you've spoken about. But can anybody override your decision? Give us a sense of how those final minutes actually played out.
Yeah, the final minutes played out. Again, it's very quiet in the control room. If issues, if problems are detected, they come up on the headset, and we discuss them. If a system is without problems, then they don't say anything other than their final go. So silence is a good thing on the intercom system. To answer your question about overriding the launch director, no, absolutely not. The launch director is in control, final authority, final say on launch or don't launch. And, I joke with people, but it's absolutely true that if in the face of everyone being go on a launch day, everyone being go but myself as the launch director, that day we don't fly. The launch director said no. So on that day we don't fly, and my 7 friends are safe on the ground. They might have a new launch director the next day because some senior manager, maybe the administrator of NASA, didn't like that decision, which would be hard to believe. But on that day, that decision is irrevocable and cannot be overridden. It is the final word. Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier about metaphorically pressing the button. So, how does the shuttle launch? I mean, this is probably one of the most popular questions you're asked. I mean, I understand there is no red button. To what degree is it automated? How does it work? Oh, by the way, sorry. Let's come back to that. Mike, let's come back to that question, if we may, because what we are doing now, what we're seeing now is a live feed from NASA TV of the Crew Dragon capsule about to dock with the ISS. So what you're seeing now, folks, is the live feed. And Mike, clearly you've got a lot to say about this. I know this is a moment you've been looking forward to. And indeed, the Falcon 9 launch with the Crew Dragon is the first. This is another first in spaceflight history. It's the first commercial vehicle to launch astronauts into space with SpaceX to the space station. So give us your thoughts about this and the launch yesterday.
Well, I've described it as the most transformational launch in NASA's history since the first launch of Alan Shepard in 1961. This was the first time that America has launched American astronauts using a private company, their rocket, their capsule, their design, their team, supported by NASA, of course, but it was their team that did this and designed it. And every other rocket launch and astronaut that ever made it to low Earth orbit on behalf of the United States was launched by NASA in NASA-owned vehicles. This is a transformational change in the way America does flights to low Earth orbit, and I think it's a tremendous change. It allows NASA to back out of the daily operations of space flight to low Earth orbit, buy that service from SpaceX in this case, and allow NASA to go back to its roots of a research and development agency more so than an operational agency, which it had become in manned spaceflight. And so this allows NASA to go back and spend its money on research and development, turn over daily operations to the contractor. And I think it's absolutely wonderful. And I'm so proud and happy for Bob and Doug. I've launched both of them on all their spaceflight missions prior to this one. I know them well. I know their families. And so I just can't imagine what they're feeling right now approaching the space station. It's truly a historic time in American spaceflight history. It can't be overstated. And then when we get Boeing and the United Launch Alliance flying their private spacecraft here later this year, hopefully that will even further bolster the concept of privatization of daily operations to low Earth orbit. It is a wonderful time.
Absolutely, Mike. And I read recently that essentially the money that has been saved by NASA in contracting out those missions to low Earth orbit to the ISS means that it can also not only direct its resource, but of course its budgets to deep space exploration with the SLS program, which we'll talk about later on. But the pictures we're seeing here are just extraordinary. I kept the kids up last night to watch the launch. Hopefully they remember that. But to see this happening before our eyes is just absolutely amazing. So we're obviously the International Space Station, as we said earlier on, wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the Space Shuttle program. What were you involved with in terms of the ISS, Mike, in that role prior to you becoming launch director? Because obviously, the components are manufactured for the ISS around the world, but they have to come through to a central point, and then of course be then loaded onto the shuttle. So give us a sense of your role in terms of the ISS and the shuttle missions.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. And to go back a little bit in history, that when the shuttle was first designed, it was always anticipated to have an international space station of some type that the shuttle would construct and service. The two were hand in glove from the very beginnings. It took a number of years to get to the space station on orbit, but nevertheless, the shuttle and the space station were always a pair designed together, designed to fly and support each other. And it's wonderful that it's up there and has been permanently manned for almost 20 years now. My role in the space station program, it was back in the early days before we even flew the first segment of the space station to orbit. We were testing them out on the ground here in Florida prior to putting them in the shuttle to be launched. And we realized that we should probably do tests that would simulate when the components were put together on orbit, that they worked together, that the electrical connections worked right, and the data feeds and the power and all the hatches worked together properly. And so we developed a program on the ground to either physically link the components together or link them virtually with emulators and find problems on the ground before we would fly them to orbit. And indeed, we found a couple of problems that would have required deorbiting major pieces of the space station before we put them up into orbit. So that was my principal job. I did that for a couple of years, led that program here at the Kennedy Space Center. And I remember when the first segment was orbited, and it had the United States, had USA on the side, and it linked up with the Russian Zarya module, and there we go. We were off and running, and it took a number of years. It took 15 years or so to fully build it, but it's a terrific laboratory on orbit, and it'll be there for many, many more years to come. Very proud of it.
Yeah, no, it's a spectacular engineering project. I mean, if ever the word plug and play could be overused, it's certainly not with the ISS. I mean, it's just an extraordinary feat of engineering, and I know that it is the most complex engineering project that's ever been undertaken, delivered by the most complex vehicle ever built. So, I mean, statistically, it's just incredible. So I know Mike Smith is going to be keeping a close eye for any further developments live on the NASA TV there. But Mike, let's go back to what we were discussing about launch day and about getting to that point of launching the shuttle and that automation that we were just about to start talking about.
Sure. We had those 22,000 parameters I talked about were called launch commit criteria that all had to be in spec and within specification, and most of them were computerized in the launch countdown, such that if a parameter was violated, it would signal to the engineer that it had violated its temperature or its pump speed or whatever the case may be, the weather. It would highlight to the engineer that there was a problem. The most key parameters, the high energy parameters associated with the main engines and the solid rocket booster, et cetera, they were keyed into the computer system that the computer would automatically hold the clock if one of those parameters was exceeded. And that happened several times, and then we would hold and we would discuss the problem, and if we solved the problem, we would clear it through the computer and press on. But basically, after we went through the polling of all the engineers at T-minus 9 minutes, the entire launch countdown sequence was automated, and the computer would launch the shuttle. Now, we always had the ability to call, every engineer had the ability to call for a hold all the way down to T-minus 10 seconds. That was the point in the countdown, 10 seconds, where afterwards we were getting into main engine start, and we didn't want a manual call after main engine start. But down to that point, any engineer could call for a hold, and we would hold the clock and discuss the issue, and then press on from there. Mm-hmm. There were two computer systems, one on the ground, and then the computers on board the shuttle, and they had to be running in sync. Mirroring each other to make sure that the shuttle was seeing the same data that the ground systems was seeing, and if it did, then it would count on down and launch the shuttle. There were 4 positions in the control room that had the ability to hit a switch to stop the countdown. I did not have a button to make it go, but I had a button to make it stop. And we did that, and because if you verbally call out for a stop, it takes a couple, 3 seconds for all that to get through the different engineers, for them then to hit the button to make it stop. And so we had key positions with a button to make it stop, and virtually immediately if the case warranted that. So that's how it worked. It would count on down, and if everything was fine, it would launch. If not, it would hold, and we would discuss the problem, why it was being held. If we had time to resolve the problem, we would do so and pick up the count and try and keep on going. If we exceeded the window, if we exceeded the amount of time we had to play with, as it were, in the countdown, then we would have to scrub and come back for another day. But virtually all. We called manual cutoffs a couple of times in the shuttle program, but very rarely. It almost always computer would cut it off.
Yeah. And we saw the main engines get cut off there on one of those video clips. And of course, the main engines can be stopped, but the SRBs cannot. So as soon as they're lit, you're committed. So that final 10 seconds, obviously that tension is rising. In terms of the crew, what are your thoughts for the crew when you've given that commit? Because there is that point of no return. Give us some. And by the way, Mike Leinbach has got some really great footage of STS-135, I believe, the final shuttle launch. So, Mike, if you can cue that up, we can perhaps talk about a shuttle launch as it happens. So we've got the launch here, Mike. Perhaps just talk us through it. We are seconds away. So what's happening?
Yeah, we're seconds away at T-minus 31 seconds. All command and control switches to the shuttle itself. It launches itself with the ground monitoring it. Here's main engine start. T-minus 6.6 seconds. You saw the engines gimbal a little bit. Those last few seconds pass very, very quickly. When the main engines start, I'm looking at data on my computer readout to make sure that the pressures are increasing and that it's going to continue to count on down to reach T0. But we did have the ability to shut the main engines down, the 3 engines on the space shuttle itself, after main engine start prior to T0. We did that 4 times in the space shuttle program. It's the most hazardous thing ever done in the space shuttle program, to light the main engines and then shut them down on the pad with the astronauts on board. But assuming we didn't shut them down, it would tick on down to 0, and then the SRBs, the solid rocket boosters, would ignite. The hold down posts that hold the shuttle to the launch pad, there are only 8 of those bolts. They explode right at T0 along with the solids igniting, and then off it goes. Because as you say, there's no turning back once you get to T0. The solid rocket fuel, once you ignite it, you cannot shut it down. You cannot throttle it. It's going to burn until it burns out, which in the case of the shuttle was 2 minutes and 5 seconds. And so that first 2 minutes and 5 seconds during ascent, the astronauts are holding on. It's a very, very dynamic, bouncy ride. It vibrates quite a bit. Once the solids burn out, and you're on just the main engines of the space shuttle, the ride smooths out quite a bit. In fact, for your audience, and you, John, I know you've done it, Mike, if you ride the shuttle launch experience here at the visitor center, you get that sensation of what it's like with the solids on and then just the main engines of the shuttle. So it's the astronauts are holding on. It's all autopilot all the way to orbit. And so while they have the ability to interrupt the programs and fly the shuttle after separation from the solid rocket boosters, if they need to do that, typically it would all fly itself all the way to orbit. So we had the ability to manually take over flying of the vehicle. Never happened in the space shuttle program. Likewise on landing, it's all autopilot. From orbit down to about 50,000 feet, and then the commander would take over and land the shuttle. That was routine, that the commander would land the shuttle. We had the ability to autopilot, auto land it all the way to touchdown, but that was never done either. It was practiced down to about 50 feet a couple of times to prove the programs, but the commanders never wanted a computer to land their ship. And for all your pilots in the audience, I'm sure they can relate to that. If you want to fly an airplane, you want to fly an airplane. You don't want a computer flying your airplane for you.
Absolutely. And in aviation and aerospace, we're all about statistics. And the mind boggles. If I'm not mistaken, Mike, 2,200 tons on launch. The SRBs alone produce 6 million pounds of thrust. I mean, did you ever sit back over your career and think these statistics are just unbelievable?
I did, and the best way to answer that is when I would go out to the launch pad, a week before launch or a day before launch, whatever the case may be, and I would stand on the mobile launch platform that held the rocket and the shuttle, and I would just look up at this thing and just in awe that it could fly. and then on launch day, when those solids lit, boy, you knew it, and you felt this, you felt the sound, you heard the sound, you felt it vibrating the windows of the Launch Control Center. It was a tremendous power. Night launches were especially spectacular. The solid rocket boosters put out so much exhaust and flame that it would light up the whole east coast of Florida. And you could read a book easily. You could easily read a book from the light of the solid rocket boosters many miles away. So it was just a spectacular system, and needed to be retired at the end. And we can get into that later. But it was a spectacular system, and one with capability that we will never see again in our lifetimes. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just see we're looking at the screen here now. So there's the shuttle riding the external tank still on its 3 main engines, and that external tank gets jettisoned, if I'm not mistaken, and falls into the atmosphere and burns up, and then it's not reusable, whereas the SRBs are. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The SRBs, after they're done burning for those 2 minutes, jettison away from the tank and the orbiter itself, and come down in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida, if you know where that is, about 120 miles from here, northeast, typically northeast, especially for all the space station launches. And then the shuttle rides on the tank all the way to orbit, the full 8.5-minute ride to orbit. And then the fuel in the external tank for the main engines is depleted. It separates, and then the orbiter is truly in orbit by itself, and the external fuel tank then the orbit of it decays, and it breaks up in the atmosphere and falls in the Pacific Ocean, always a little bit south of Hawaii. Okay. Never to be reused, but the solid rocket boosters are recovered and cleaned up and refueled and used another time. This is a roll to heads up program that you're looking at right now. We went to this late in the shuttle program. It improved the getting to orbit by the angle of the main engines. A little difficult to explain, but that's what it's doing. It's rolling to a heads up position instead of heads down. So it's getting ready to burn out of fuel and then separate.
Yeah. Now, there's a term, transoceanic abort, which was a term used during the shuttle program. Now, some of our viewers in the UK would have been to Fairford, to there's a big military air show there every July. There's another place in France, Istres, and then Zaragoza in Spain. Tell us the roles of those airfields in the case of an abort, and how did that work?
Yeah, we had different aborts in the space shuttle program. We had 5 different types of aborts. We had the on-pad abort that we talked about a little bit before, when the main engine would start and then shut down. The transatlantic abort that we're talking about now is a situation where everything is fine at liftoff, but then during ascent, 1 or 2 main engines of the space shuttle fail. They shut down safely instead of going into catastrophic failure. But when 1 or 2 of those engines shut down, now you don't have enough energy to get to orbit, and so you have to land somewhere, and that's what the transatlantic abort landing sites were for. We had 3 available on any given launch day. 1 of them had to be go, weather-wise and technically able to receive the orbiter, such that if engines did go out before it made it to orbit, then the astronauts could land the space shuttle in one of these abort landing sites in Europe or the west coast of Africa. Never done in the space shuttle program, but we had to have that ability to land in an emergency. Other aborts, we could abort once around, it was called, where if you had a cabin leak or something like that, the orbiter would go all the way around the Earth one time and land back in Florida. We also had a return to launch site abort, that if those engines that I talked about before failed really early in ascent, then the orbiter could come back and land in Florida on launch day. And also never done in the history of the shuttle program. But so we had these contingencies available to us with the idea of it's just insurance to protect the astronauts in case something happened.
Yeah.
There you see
Absolutely.
separation from the orbiter. And it was attached at 3 points there at the back of the orbiter. And on the belly, you can see some darker areas. That's where it attached to the external fuel tank, where all the fuel went from the tank into the orbiter for the 3 main engines. That V-shaped thing up in the foreground of the picture connected up to the nose of the orbiter and was made for the 3rd connection point between the space shuttle and the external fuel tank.
Right. Fascinating stuff, Mike. We could spend hours just talking about the ascent, which of course was your life for 11 years or more so. I wanted to move on to, the personal side of the role, and the astronauts themselves and the relationship that you had with the astronauts. I'm assuming that was actually a critical thing, is to actually operate as a team, not just on the ground in the firing room, but of course the wider team, including the astronauts. How did that work?
Well, here again, it developed. It was developed in the early days of America's spaceflight history, where the launch director absolutely got to know the astronauts, so that on launch day, I knew in the case of the shuttle, my 7 friends on board there, so that I had a better sense of, am I ready to commit these friends, not just astronauts or these people, these are my friends. Am I ready to commit them to lift off or not? And so over the course of preparing for a shuttle launch, there were different opportunities where the astronauts would come to the Kennedy Space Center for training or other events, or I'd go out to Houston and at the Johnson Space Center and meet them out there. But there was always a relationship between the launch director and the astronauts. I wanted to get to know them so that I knew who I was launching. They wanted to get to know me, frankly, as the person who had their backs, the final go, no go, and had their backs on launch day. And so it was a reciprocal thing. They trusted me, I trusted them, and so it was an opportunity to develop those relationships so that I could make that final decision on launch day. And we would do different things. We'd have dinners for them. We'd have parties. We'd go out drinking beer. We could have breakfast with them if that was the proper thing to do. Just different ways of getting to know them in a more personal setting, so that we had that relationship that was so critical in that final decision to launch or don't launch.
Yeah,
it was absolutely critical. The launch director gets to know the astronauts. There's no question about it, and I couldn't have done the job without knowing them.
Mm-hmm. And Mike, tell me about your feelings on launch day. Professional sportsmen and men and women talk about game face, game day. I mean, you've been working to this moment for weeks and months for every launch. Were there any superstitions? How did obviously the team bond? Give us an idea of how the team operated and your feelings on the day.
Yeah, it was interesting on launch day. It truly is game day, and so you you drive in from home. I mean, you get up early, you adjust your sleep cycle so that it matches the liftoff time. I would drive into work and I would see the shuttle out on the launch pad and realize that, boy, we're about to do something really special today. And then I would go in the control center. Everyone brought food because you're there for a long 10, 12 hours or so. We would bring food to set up in a conference room, and the launch team would cycle through the food room and get a little bit of nourishment, and as well as just shoot the breeze with other engineers or test team management. There I'm waving to the crowd. So it was truly game day, and you put your game face on, and you go down and to the control room and report in and get a status briefing from the person who preceded you in your position, whatever that position may be. And then you take your position and lead the team all the way down through the T0. And different launch directors had different management styles. In the early days of the space shuttle program, You know, it was back in the early 80s, and management style was different than in the 2010s. I had a different style than my predecessor. Mine was more of a not a confidant, but a cohort, a companion in the process, more so than a leader, more so than a dictator. Certainly not dictator. Some of the early launch directors in the programs, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, were very, very hard. They would yell and pound on the table. That was not my style at all. I would call out people by first name on the intercom, which before my time was unheard of. You never approached anybody on the intercom system by their first name. But that was my style. You know, if an engineer did a good job, I'd say, "Hey, Chuck, good job," and they'd say, "Thanks, Mike." And then that just made for a better, in my view, a better relationship between all members of the launch team, and they knew who was in charge. I knew who was in charge. I didn't have to demonstrate that I was in charge. It just naturally occurred, and they liked the softer approach. And indeed, that's typical of most management positions, you know, around the world nowadays. It's a softer approach than it used to be.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Fascinating stuff, Mike. Now, you know, there are major world events where we all remember where we were, what we were doing. And I want to move on to some of the darker days in NASA's history with the shuttle program. Of course, some would argue they blossomed opportunities. You know, they allowed NASA to have a rebirth. You know, it's been said that, you know, high risk, high return. You know, risk is the price of progress. There's perhaps no better metaphor than that in terms of NASA and space exploration. So I'd like to turn to the Challenger accident, if I may, in 1986. Can you just describe to us, you know, what occurred on that morning, and what were the after effects in terms of the administration?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And I was working here at the time. I had came to NASA in 1984 as that engineer, and of course the accident was in 1986. I remember being out out by the vehicle assembly building, the large building that was built for the Apollo program, watching launch that morning, and it was extremely cold. We were huddling behind staircases just to help block the wind, so it was extremely cold. But I was new to NASA. I was not in the control team at all. I was a structural engineer, and when it lifted off and I saw it fail, I expected to see Challenger come out of that big cloud and land behind me, and that return to launch site abort. Of course, it couldn't have done that given the failure that it had. But at the time, I didn't know. The decision process leading up to the launch of Challenger was I can only describe it as awful. There were engineers at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, who designed the solid rocket boosters and the O-rings inside the booster that failed. The booster, there are joints in the SRBs, the solid rocket booster. They're delivered to us in 4 big sections. They're put together. Oh boy. They're put together here at the Kennedy Space Center, and to seal those segments together are these O-rings, and the O-ring failed, and it allowed the combustion products, the gas, to get out of the side of the booster, and it penetrated the tank, and then the tank erupted. The engineers that designed that, the night before launch, they knew it was going to be extremely cold, and they lobbied their manager not to launch the next morning because they knew it was going to be too cold. And the manager in charge, a mid-level manager, said, "No, I'll be the one to decide that." And so did not pass, and so that manager did not pass on the engineering concern to the launch director. Gene Thomas, rest his soul, was the launch director for Challenger. Never knew about that discussion the night before launch, that it was going to be too cold and therefore we should stand down. That in part led to that mission management team that I described before, I say in part, that led to the mission management team that I described before, because there is a perfectly valid reason not to launch the space shuttle. Engineers knew it was going to be too cold, even though the technical criteria, those 22,000 parameters, had been met and were go. The engineers knew it was going to be too cold. And so we formed that mission management team to capture those types of things, those types of concerns, and then report them to the launch director and let the team decide if we should launch or not, rather than have issues like that stop at some mid-level, which is what it did for the Challenger accident. And so we solved the technical issue with Challenger. The booster was improved and performed flawlessly for the rest of the space shuttle program. The management issue, the awful decision process, was fixed by that mission management team creation, which worked perfectly for the rest of the space shuttle program. And so lost 7 astronauts, tragic, no doubt, but we fixed the hardware and we fixed the management issues, and got back to flying again. That was the major lesson learned from Challenger, was how to deal with undocumented reasons that are valid reasons to stay on the ground, and how do you capture those? How do you bring them to management's awareness, leadership's awareness, so that that's factored into the launch decision itself, along with everything else. So that was a major decision, major lesson learned in the space shuttle program. Very, very dark day in NASA's history, but we did learn from it, and we moved on. And as I say, the improvements to the boosters worked flawlessly, and the improvements to the management process worked flawlessly as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, the whole purpose of the space shuttle was to be a science lab, to build a space station. Of course, the legacy is the Hubble telescope, as well as the space station and many other things. And it would have been wrong to stop the program. And thank goodness there was the cause that was found, and you could move on. I'd like to move the clock forwards to February 2003, and another dark day. This time, Columbia. If I understand correctly, it was the first orbiter to launch into orbit. It was the 28th flight of the vehicle, and on re-entry, there was a tragedy that, of course, nobody had expected. Can you tell us about that, Mike? And of course, I know this is very personal to you. You've spent a lot of time on this. You've written a book about it. We can talk about that as well. So, give us a perspective on this one, Mike.
Well, this one actually, the management decisions, or lack of decisions, let me put it this way: we had recovered from Challenger 17 years earlier, and yet some of the leadership decisions, management decisions, had crept back into the program and allowed Columbia to land without doing a full investigation of the problem on Columbia before we committed it to landing. On launch day, a piece of foam on the external tank broke off and hit the wing of the orbiter and damaged the thermal protection system somehow. And then when Columbia was coming back through the atmosphere, which you're looking at now, hot plasma gas, which is really burning oxygen molecules, got inside the left wing and melted the wing from the inside out. The space shuttle is an aluminum machine, and the aluminum melted the aluminum of the wing melted, and the wing came off, and then it broke up aerodynamically from there. But we knew we suffered damage to the orbiter on launch day. We didn't know how bad it was. Some of the video that we had of launch was out of focus, and we had one camera that wasn't working. But we had engineers who knew that was a significant impact on the wing of the orbiter, much greater than we'd ever suffered before. And they were lobbying for additional data, pictures of the orbiter in orbit from spy satellites, as a matter of fact, they wanted to get pictures of the damage so that we could decide whether it was safe to land or not. That went virtually unheard by the decision makers and that during that mission. And so there's a valid reason to get more data that was not ignored completely, but virtually ignored, and pressed on with the mission and landing, assuming that the damage was going to be minor, even though we didn't know how bad the damage was. We had no way to quantify how bad the damage was without some visual evidence. The astronauts couldn't get it on board the shuttle. It was impossible. And so we would have had to have called up a national asset to get that picture, and could have done that. But management during those deliberations chose not to do that, and so bad management decisions crept back into the space shuttle program and allowed us to land Columbia without getting all the data we needed in order to clear it for landing or declare it unlandable, and then we would have had to done something different. But here you see the foam breaking off in the external fuel tank, that lighter colored piece that hits the wing and then disintegrates into thousands and thousands of very small pieces. That was one of the best views we had of the foam strike. I believe this next one coming up will be the view that we used over and over and over again to try to decide how bad the damage was. Visually, you can't see any damage, but somehow it compromised the thermal protection system. And then on reentry, that very, very hot gas got inside the wing. So bad management decisions crept back into the shuttle program. We did various things after Columbia to reinforce the need to listen to the engineers, listen to the hardware when it's trying to talk to you. We used to call it that. And the rest of the shuttle program proceeded on fine, but that bad decision process crept back into the program after so many successful launches. And so, we had a specification in the shuttle program, John, that said you should not damage the tiles. You should not have any dings to the tiles at all, zero, throughout the whole mission. And yet every mission we had dozens and dozens of minor dings to the tiles. And it was always just a maintenance issue, a turnaround maintenance issue on the ground, and not a safety of flight issue. And so that normalization of deviance, we accepted those minor damages as normal. And so we accepted that normalization of deviance, and that crept into the decision process not to take that picture on orbit of Columbia. So the normalization of deviance is a real thing. We got overconfident in the shuttle system that it was able to withstand certain amount of damage and still bring the astronauts home safely. Arrogance a little bit, but mostly normalization of deviance and complacency allowed us to make a bad decision, and it cost Rick Husband and his 6 crewmates their lives.
Yeah, it's very, very sad, and of course that's the cause. And then there was the aftermath, and as we said in the introduction, you led the debris recovery team across Texas and Louisiana, and then afterwards at KSC, the reconstruction teams. Can you give us some insights into those periods?
Well, that was very, very, very difficult time, not just for me personally, but for everyone on the team. We had this investigation team pre-established. We'd set it up a long time before the accident, called the rapid response team, and that was the team that would go anywhere in the world that the shuttle ended up. I was the lead of that team, being the launch director. And so the day of the accident, I took the first plane load of people from the Kennedy Space Center out to Texas to start setting up the debris recovery processes. I remember the mood on that airplane that night. It was a military airplane with those sling seats along the sides. I think it was a 135, if I recall correctly. It was cold. This was in February. Even for Florida, it was cold. We were sitting in those sling seats, and no one was speaking at all. I remember thinking about it. Boy, here I am, the leader of this team, and no one's saying anything. So I got up and got on the intercom to the rest of my teammates, and I don't even remember what I said to them. I said something like, we're all in this together. Let's go. We owe it to Rick and his team to go find the debris and figure out what happened and fly again. But I don't remember exactly what I said. Doesn't matter. But we ended up out there in Shreveport, Louisiana, the night of the accident, and set up the opening phases of the recovery the next morning. The difficult part was, not only did we lose 7 astronauts, which is horrible. I mean, you cannot imagine the grief. We also lost an orbiter that people worked on their whole careers, and that they loved the machine. Difficult to explain, very, very difficult to explain. But when you spend your whole career working on a particular machine, and the guts of that machine inside and out, it was almost like losing an 8th crew member, and so the team had to get over that. But we set up the initial phases of the recovery out there in Texas and Louisiana. On day 12 of the recovery, I was asked to come back to the Kennedy Space Center and lead the reconstruction of the debris. Over the course of 3 months, searching an area larger than the state of Rhode Island, and maybe better for your audience. We physically walked an area 120 miles long by 10 miles wide. And so on the tours, you may remember, John, that I asked people to think about a town that's 120 miles from your hometown, wherever that may be, and then something 10 miles perpendicular to that line. And imagine walking that huge area, physically walking that huge area. So we did that over 3 months with 25,000 people over 3 months, and found 38% of the space shuttle by weight, and sent that back here to the Kennedy Space Center to be reconstructed, which is what the National Transportation Safety Board wanted us to do, to try to figure out the cause of the accident based just on the debris, which we did. And then another team studied the accident based on all data, all downlink data from the vehicle and pictures that the public had sent in, that type of thing. So we had these 2 teams set up, the data team led by a flight director in Houston, and the reconstruction team that I did here in Florida. And if those 2 teams agreed on the cause, then you had it knocked, and there'd be no question what happened. And we did. We both agreed it was that foam that came off the tank that hit the orbiter and caused a breach in the thermal protection system. Throughout that whole process, there were so many issues. The biggest thing that I had to look out for with the team was the emotions of the team members, knowing that they were working on chunks of debris that looked nothing like a space shuttle. Of that 38% that we got back, most of the pieces were the size of your cell phone or smaller. The largest piece was a piece of the belly, about 13 feet long and 2 feet wide. That was the largest piece by far. So there was an emotional aspect of there behind me in that picture. You can see the debris laying on the floor, and these were larger pieces, obviously. And so we had to deal with the emotion of losing the shuttle, along with the engineering work of figuring out what happened to it. And I always say that if you could separate the emotion out of the study, it was a fascinating engineering study. There's no doubt. I mean, we did engineering analysis, forensic analysis on the debris, which had never been done before, and proved what had happened. But the problem was you could not separate the emotion out. And so every now and then the team would need a break. And we went to minor league ball games. We had impromptu parties. We'd take an afternoon off here or there just because we needed an afternoon off. Different things to watch out for, to make sure that the team emotionally was getting through this trauma. in addition to studying what had happened. And so as the leader of that team, that was my major focus. That was my major focus, was to make sure that the team got through it emotionally. And that was very difficult. The team has stayed in touch, even though a lot of them got laid off at the end of the space shuttle program, and they're in different states. A lot of us still stay in touch and have formed friendships that will last the rest of our lives based on that tragedy of that situation and how we got through it together. Very, very difficult time. I remember showing the debris to the families of the astronauts. We invited them to come to the reconstruction hangar to see the debris, and it was on a Saturday. We shut down the whole hangar. It was only just a handful of us to show the crew families around, the husbands and wives, and that was the most difficult thing I've ever done in my career, was to show those families what was left of the space shuttle that their loved one died in, and very difficult.
Yeah, I can understand. And you know, I was fortunate enough to go on a tour with you at the visitor center at KSC, where some of the debris from Challenger and Columbia is laid out. It's done so respectfully. It tells a story, and Mike, like you and I said before today, it's important. It really is important that these stories are told. You know, risk is the price of of progress, and I think you know, it's important for us to all understand that. So I really do appreciate you laying bare your emotions and your experiences from those dark times. So thank you. Moving on, we should talk about the orbiter itself, but just very briefly, because we have a lot of questions coming in, Mike. Most of them I'm sure you've heard before, but just give us an understanding about the orbiter itself. I mean, you said it was an aluminium construction, like a regular aircraft, but of course the thing that made it different was it wasn't powered by air-breathing engines, and it was covered in these tiles. Just give us some perspective on the machine.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. The space shuttle is aluminum. It's an aluminum skin, aluminum frame machine, airplane. That if we were to strip off all the tiles and all the thermal blankets and all the thermal protection system, it would look like any other airplane in the world. You know, obviously different configuration with the delta wing and the pods in the back, but aluminum skin, and then you put on all those tiles and thermal protection, and that's what allows it to get back from space safely. So aluminum machine, it weighs roughly 200,000 pounds empty. Rides on the back of the 747 for turnarounds, but aluminum machine. It has no power on landing day. There you see it coming in for a landing. It's a glider, totally a glider, with the exception of thrusters to help it steer, and also the aero surfaces, which are the rudder and speed brake on the vertical tail that you can see splayed out at this moment, slowing it down. And then on each wing are two aero surfaces. We call them elevons. They're a combination of an aerator and an elevon, and that provided the aerodynamic steering in atmospheric flight. And so briefly, as I said before, from orbit to about 50,000 feet, it's all autopilot. And then the commander takes over flying the machine once it's in atmospheric flight, and it's coming in at a 19-degree glide slope, unpowered. They have one shot at landing. Obviously cannot go around. They have one shot at landing. Typically, the commander would turn flying over to his pilot. The commander is like a pilot of an airplane, and the co-pilot is what we call the pilot. So the commander is flying it on the left seat, behind the left windows. And so for a brief period of time, he would turn it over to the pilot to get a feel what it really felt like. There was a control stick that they would fly it with between their legs, and then brakes and toe brakes and nose wheel steering. for steering after touchdown. It had a drag chute that would come out after main gear touchdown to help slow it down. But you have one shot at landing, 19 degrees. You're coming in, you land at almost 200 miles per hour. And the astronauts train in a specially equipped Gulfstream airplane. They practice landings. They have a requirement to practice landing at either here in Florida or out in California a minimum of 1,000 times. Typically, a commander would fly at least 2,000 times those approaches because you have one shot, and you have one shot. We had very strict criteria, weather criteria for landing, and one of the major criteria was crosswinds on the runway, because since it was unpowered and you had one shot, you didn't want to be blown off the runway. So we had a 15 knot crosswind limit during daytime and 12 knot crosswind at nighttime. Here you see them coming in on final, again coming straight down, and then at the very final end he would pull the nose up, flare up, and touch down and roll out. And the astronauts always took pride in where they hit the runway, where they touched down and rolled out, and without exception, they were within probably the width of a dime, half of an inch off of center line when they were finally wheel stop. So it's unpowered. You got atmospheric flight going on right now. Here you see him pulling up, flaring up. He or she, we had two female commanders in the history of the Space Shuttle program, Eileen Collins and Pam Melroy. The gear come down, two main gear, two tires on each gear, nose landing gear, two smaller tires on the nose. Here it's coming in, and you'll see it touch down just off center line. I don't know if we're going to have that video or not, but just slightly off center line. And then the commander corrected for that and ended up being dead on the center line at wheel stop. Drag chute was added later in the program, maybe about 2/3 of the way. No, I'm sorry, about halfway through the program, we added the drag chute to help it slow down. We had abort landing sites not only in Europe and Africa that we discussed before, but anywhere in the world. If the orbiter got in trouble and had to make an emergency landing, we had landing sites designated, dozens of them around the world. And really all you needed was about an 9,000 foot runway. And that's very short, I understand. You needed about 8,000 or 9,000 foot runway with TACAN, and then you could land the shuttle anywhere in the world. But for those shorter runways, that's why we added the drag chute to help slow it down. On some of the landing sites, we had an arresting net at the end of the runway that they would erect to catch the orbiter before it went too far off the runway. But fortunately, that never happened either in the Space Shuttle program.
Yeah, well, thank you for talking us through the landing. I mean, it's incredible, and there's some footage I've seen of you, Mike, standing beneath the orbiter on some of those landings. So, or you were responsible for launching the vehicle and its crew, and then you get to see it landing and obviously be one of the first to greet the crew on their return from space. What was that like?
John, I always describe that as the best part of my job was getting to greet the astronauts when they got off the orbiter here in Florida after a successful mission. Obviously, it meant they were home safe, and so yeah, I was one of the few that got to go out on the runway and greet them, shake their hands, and they'd get off the orbit and they'd be a little wobbly, because they've been in zero gravity for 2 weeks, and so I'd put my arm around one of them, kind of steady them a little bit, something like that. But then we would just shoot the breeze. We'd walk around underneath the orbiter. You put your hand up by the tiles. You could still feel the heat coming off the thermal protection off the belly of the orbiter. Just a magical feeling walking underneath that thing after knowing it had been in space for 2 weeks and well over 1 million miles flown. And the astronauts would look around, they'd look at their spaceship and just revel in the fact that they were in orbit for 2 weeks. And then they would walk, and then the astronauts would walk around and greet some of the ground crew, people that they met as they prepared the vehicle for flight. They were meeting on the ground after landing. And so it was kind of, it all comes together, it all comes around. It was full circle. And that was, again, that was the best part of my job was greeting those astronauts on landing day. And by far, that was the coolest thing I got to do as a launch director.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I wanted to move on to the legacy of the shuttle program before we go on to our final few questions. Now, I picked up some more stats. 4/5 of all people who've gone into space have done so on the shuttle. That's about 355, I believe. The shuttle program flew a total of 21,152 orbits and flew 542 million miles, which is enough to get to Jupiter. Now, that in itself is an incredible legacy, but for you, what's the legacy of the shuttle program?
Well, it's kind of two things. If you look back in the history of America's manned flight programs, it was the next logical step in the programs that started with suborbital flights, and then three orbits with just one astronaut, then the Gemini program and Apollo landing on the moon. What shuttle did was it allowed us to live and work in low Earth orbit for 2 weeks at a time. It carried 7 astronauts, but the key is it was 2 weeks of working and living in low Earth orbit to learn how to do that. Previously, we never set up shop in low Earth orbit. It was something to do to train for the Apollo program. Gemini and Mercury were stepping stones for Apollo. Shuttle allowed us to live and work in low Earth orbit. We deployed satellites. We worked on satellites. We brought satellites home. We launched the Hubble Space Telescope and worked on it in orbit 5 different times with different orbiters. So the one legacy is living and working in low Earth orbit for 2 weeks at a time. The follow-on to that is the International Space Station, where we have learned to live and work in low Earth orbit permanently. It's been permanently manned since the year 2000, and so that's the next logical step. The next step, while I'm on the logic here, the next step is to live and work on the moon permanently. We've only ever visited the moon for the maximum of 3 or 4 days at a time. With only 12 humans have ever set foot on the moon for the maximum of 4 days at a time. And so the next logical step in the progression of getting off this planet is to go learn to live and work on the moon. And that's what President Trump yesterday reiterated when he was here in Florida for the launch, and a rousing endorsement of going back to the moon and living and working on the moon. And we can talk about that a little bit later if you want. The other legacy of the Space Shuttle program was reusability. Prior to the shuttle, all rockets, let me put it this way, all astronauts flew in a brand new spacecraft on a brand new rocket, one-time use only. And so every astronaut flew a brand new vehicle. The shuttle changed all that. It was the first reusable spacecraft ever. And we learned how to deal with reusability. We learned how not to deal with reusability, but nevertheless, it was the first reusable spacecraft. And those lessons learned have gone into SpaceX as they reuse their booster. Booster lands on the barge out in the ocean or back here on land, and they turn it around and fly it again. Boeing will do the same with their spacecraft. And so the lessons we learned in shuttle from a reusability standpoint are absolutely key to the future. And here again, how to deal with it and how not to deal with it. We did not pay attention to the foam damage to the orbiter like we should have, and allowed the Columbia accident to occur. But on the other hand, we had electrical wires that shorted out during one mission. And so we stood down the shuttle fleet after that particular mission. It was safe. Everything went fine. Redundancy kicked in. But we inspected every inch of every wire on every shuttle, which is hundreds of miles of wires. And so from that perspective, we heard the hardware talking to us, and we knew we had other issues with wires. And so we stood down for 9 months and fixed all those issues, thousands of issues, of minor issues on wires. But there we learned, there the lesson learned from listening to the hardware paid off. And so the shuttle program is really those two things: learn to live and work in low Earth orbit 2 weeks at a time, and how to deal with reusable spacecraft. Those are the two, in my mind, the two true legacies of the Space Shuttle program.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, you talk about stepping stones. I mean, if we just look ahead to the future, for a little while here, we saw, the history being made yesterday with the Falcon 9 rocket and the Crew Dragon. There's the Boeing Starliner that you mentioned, and then there's the NASA refocus on SLS. I mean, arguably, there's never been a more exciting time in spaceflight, and I think in the coming decade, it's going to be fascinating to see where we are. And here we are. There's the Crew Dragon docked on the ISS.
Oh boy, look at that! That's outstanding. Boy, oh boy. Now, if that doesn't give you chills, nothing will.
Incredible, absolutely fantastic.
That's good stuff. And,
it really is. No, it really is.
Yeah, I mean, the future is really bright, and I wish it had gotten here sooner. I mean, we're 9 years after the shuttle shut down, but it didn't. We are where we are, and so now we've got SpaceX flying astronauts soon. Boeing will. The SLS that you mentioned is NASA's next big heavy lift rocket, and that's the one that will get us back to the moon to learn to live on the moon permanently. So yes, there's been a lull in activity, I'll say, from a manned launch perspective, but now things are turning around, and I'll tell you, John, the mood here in Florida. I mean, I went out yesterday to get a sandwich for my wife and I, and the traffic locally was incredible. There were tens of thousands of people here to see SpaceX's launch. And that's back to the early days of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, where tens of thousands of people would come to town to set up along the river and watch launch from 5 miles away. And it happened again. And so the mood locally and the mood in, really around the world, I believe, has changed for the good. There's an excitement around here that had been missing for a number of years, and it's just really, really good to feel it again.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, what wonderful words. And hopefully when air travel fires up again, KSC is going to be a buzz with visitors, because we talk about the Inspire-Ability talks. I mean, going, if you've never been to KSC, you really must go. I mean, if you want to be bamboozled with what we've done as a race, it's just incredible. The whole human spaceflight program in NASA has just been fantastic. Mike, I want to move on to your retirement, because we must give you the opportunity to talk about the book, Bringing Columbia Home. It is fantastic. I've read the book. I couldn't put it down. It really is a wonderful way to describe that period with NASA, and of course with your career, and then of course the tours at Kennedy Space Center. So tell us a bit about those two briefly.
Well, thanks for allowing me to plug the book. I think you might be able to see it over my shoulder. I have it strategically placed on the top of my desk, but it tells the final chapter of the Space Shuttle Columbia. It was our first orbiter, meant a lot to everyone, obviously, and no one had told the final story of the accident and the recovery of the debris and the astronauts and the reconstruction. And since I had a little bit to do with most of those things, I figured I almost felt, I don't want to call it an obligation to write it, but I'm glad I did, because now the final story of Columbia is told, and it's told with first person narrative, which I was opposed to, but the production company convinced me that's the best way to tell the story. But anyway, that's a minor thing. It tells the final story of the Columbia accident and all the people that helped us find it and fix it and fly it again. It did lead to the retirement of the Space Shuttle program, which caused the gap from shuttle to yesterday, an American launch capability of astronauts from our soil. During that time, we paid Russians, I believe it was $17 billion for access to the space station, a lot of money. But that's over now, and so we're feeling good about that too. You know, we were into. I have to tell you, we were in discussions with a movie company to turn Bringing Columbia Home into a feature-length picture right before the pandemic hit, and so all that industry is shut down, as you can well imagine. The future of movie theaters is in question. I think they'll come back, of course, but anyway, we were in discussions about turning the book into a movie. I hope that happens one day, because then more people will be exposed to the final story of Columbia. I do tours out at the Space Center, so at the visitor complex out at the Space Center that you've been on, John, and so I'd invite all the listeners that if you're in Central Florida, those tours right now are on hold as well because of the pandemic, but should be kicking back in hopefully sometime this summer. I don't have a date for you, and I don't have what the changes may be to the tour itself, because obviously with social distancing and limiting crowds, that's going to affect things. The visitor center opened back up a couple of days ago, limited hours, limited attendance, limited attractions, but you're starting to see that come back into being again, and so, you know, the future of the Space Center and the visitor complex is bright. I can't tell you when it's going to turn bright. Right now, it's you know, being affected by the pandemic, obviously, like everything else in the world, but it'll be back, and we love bragging about the shuttle program and other space adventures. So again, for everyone looking on, listening, if you ever find yourself in East Central Florida, please come by the visitor center. You'll see spacecraft, you'll see debris, you'll see people that love the program, describe the programs, and again, it's not a theme park like the theme parks in Orlando. This is real, and so you'll get a sense of what space flight preparations was all about, and I'm glad to do that. It's personally very rewarding. I get to keep my finger in the pie, as it were, and so it's fun, and it allowed you and me to meet. So it's got to be good, right?
Absolutely. And no, I can highly recommend it. It is just a fascinating place to be, and of course, you know, the tours that you give, Mike, are exceptional. I mean, it truly is behind the scenes, and you know, hopefully those will resume very soon. Well, Mike, that brings us to the end of what has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a huge amount today, as I'm sure everybody else has. We do have some questions. I'm going to limit them to 5, just because of the time. We want to get you back to your day and to lunch. So if I may, I'm going to kick off with a question from my 13-year-old daughter, because I can, being the host. So Katie's question was, what was your biggest challenge as a launch director?
The biggest challenge as launch director, it was to get the first mission after the Columbia accident. We call it the return to flight mission, and it was to get the team focused back into doing what we did for a living, which was launch the space shuttle. We had been in a recovery and reconstruction for a couple of years, and now it was time to get back into flying and doing the job that we love to do. And so turning the team from a reconstruction and recovery from the accident into what it was, being the launch team and launching these incredible vehicles, was a challenge. But here again, we did it as a team, we did it as friends, and we did it for the legacy of Rick Husband and his crew, and so we needed to do it right. We could not have suffered another failure. That's certainly true. And so I needed the team to think about what they do for a living and the data that they review and the go, no go they give and why, and just get them focused. And with that in mind, I did something a little controversial in hindsight, and that I've been told was controversial in hindsight. 4 months after the accident, 4 months after we lost Columbia, I had my first launch team training exercise, because I didn't want the launch team to lose their edge. I didn't want them to go too long without having the environment supporting a launch team simulation where you practice launching the shuttle. And so 4 months after the accident, we kicked off the training regimen, which took another 2 years to actually culminate in a launch. And so it was very quick after the accident, but here again, I didn't want them to go too long and lose their edge. And so that was the rationale behind doing it so quickly. So that was the biggest challenge, I'd say.
Yeah. The next question here is, where do the retired shuttles reside at the moment?
Oh boy, let's see. Atlantis is here at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex that, John, you've seen. Let's see. Discovery is at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., out at the facility out by Dulles International Airport called the Udvar Hazy Center. It's part of the Smithsonian, but it's out by Dulles Airport in Northern Virginia. We have Endeavour at the Science Center in Los Angeles, California. Let's see, those are the three operational. And then we have Enterprise, which conducted the approach and landing tests out in California. It was never an orbiter that made it to space, but it did all those approach tests, approach landing tests for the program. And it's in New York Harbor on the aircraft carrier Intrepid. They have an air museum associated with that aircraft carrier, and that's where Enterprise is. So that's where they are. Challenger is buried in an old Minuteman missile silo not far from here on the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, and Columbia is stored in the vehicle assembly building piece by piece. We created a debris loan program, something I'm personally very proud of, where we lend out pieces of Columbia to institutions to study. And I'm proud to say that 3 people have gotten their PhDs by studying debris from Columbia. So that's where they all are.
Okay. And the next question here is, what is the difference between Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral?
Well, that's a good question. Cape Canaveral is a little town south of the Space Center. So if you looked at the local area, the Kennedy Space Center is a government facility on government property adjacent to the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. And so Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Air Force Station are adjacent to each other. And then just south of there is a little town called Cape Canaveral. And that's where the astronauts would drive their Corvettes around town and go to the pizza joints and whatnot. Cape Canaveral is a typical Florida beach town. It's right on the ocean, and it has all the pizza joints and motels that you would associate with any other little beach town in Florida.
Oh, cool. Okay, and the next question here is, did you ever have a fear of failure, and how did you manage that? That's a great question.
A fear of failure. Yeah, no, that is a good question. No, I never feared failure. I knew intellectually failure was something that could happen in the shuttle program. After all, the space shuttle is a machine, and machines can break, and so failure was part of it. What my job principally was to make sure that we did all we could to avoid failure. But if something broke on the shuttle, whether it turned into a catastrophic failure or something much less catastrophic, we had failures all the time in the space shuttle program. Different hardware would fail, and we'd fix it. It was part of the process. Recovering from minor failures was very typical. Recovering from those two major failures was anything but typical, but was necessary. And as a leader in the shuttle program, it was my job to help the team get through that second failure. So no, I never dwelled on failures. I always knew intellectually it could happen, and we would deal with it when it did, whatever it turned out to be.
Yeah. Here we go. Look, some more historic pictures coming through now. It looks like
Oh boy.
the guys are getting ready to go into the space station, it would seem. Hard to tell. I think so.
Yeah, they're out of their launch and entry suits. They're into their civvies, as it were, up there. Yeah, that's good.
So here's the last question. What was the highlight, Mike, of your NASA career?
Boy, you know, I've been so fortunate over my career that to pin it down to one highlight, I don't know that I can do that. One of the things that sticks with me, and this is going to take a little while to explain, so I hope we got a couple of minutes, but at the end of the Space Shuttle program, you know, we knew it was going to retire after Columbia's accident. We were told to finish the International Space Station and retire the shuttle. So we knew the end was coming, but no one had ever. And with the end of the shuttle program, thousands of people were going to get laid off from their jobs. That was inevitable. We had over 8,000 people here at the Kennedy Space Center who did nothing but work on the Space Shuttle program, and that's just here at the Kennedy Space Center. So at the end of a major program, we knew people were going to get laid off, and no one had ever apologized to them. And so one day, leading up to the final launch countdown during a simulation that we had, I apologized to the team on behalf of NASA because of some of the decisions that were made and programs that were canceled. We didn't have another program to transition into. And so therefore, thousands of people were going to get laid off, and no one ever acknowledged that to the team, and I did, and you know, I caught some flack for that, but it was the right thing to do for my team. They needed to hear from a NASA leader that some of the decisions that led up to the retirement of the shuttle and not having another program to transition straight into were not good decisions, and so I did that, and you know, I look back on that and think it was exactly the right thing to do. The team appreciated it, and yeah, I caught some grief for it, but that's okay. The team needed to hear from Leinbach that you know, things will be okay, but right now we're going to be hurting because you're going to get laid off, and the day after Atlantis landed on the final space shuttle mission, layoff notices started going out to 4,500 people just here at the Kennedy Space Center who were going to lose their jobs because the space shuttle program was over. Very difficult days. We knew it was coming, so we could prepare for it, but nevertheless, you lose your job. There's no easy way to get through that. And so anyway, that's a memory I'll never lose.
Yeah, and an emotional time. I mean, for you know, and it's about the people, isn't it? You know, it's about the friendships and the bond you all make in such a unique environment, knowing you're sort of closing a chapter of history. I mean, I can only imagine what those times must have been like. Well, Mike, that brings us to an end of what has been a wonderful talk. Mike, thanks for giving your time, and more importantly, thank you for, I think, being so honest, you know, laying bare your thoughts and your feelings, and giving us such a rare insight, perhaps, that some of the books won't tell you about the shuttle program and what it's like to be a launch director. I'm going to bring in Mike Miller-Smith now. I think I'd also like to again let everybody know about your book, Mike, Bringing Columbia Home, about those tours of KSD. Just, you know, really good opportunity there to get under the hood, as you say in the US, Mike, and really see what it's like to see Kennedy Space Center in its daily operation. And you don't get to do that without your tours. So with that, Mike Miller-Smith, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much, Mike. Well, that was a really amazing time to spend together. That was like being sat in the pub hearing about an amazing aircraft, an amazing story, an amazing space vehicle. Just amazing. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Mike, for your time. And I think, so many highlights in that talk, but just to hear about after it had safely re-entered and landed, just to walk around underneath and feel the heat coming off the tiles from the re-entry just a few minutes earlier. That must be amazing. So that insight was just brilliant. Thank you. So I'll let everybody get on with your afternoons now and get to watching the rest of the Crew 2 demo with the docking of the Dragon. It looks like the guys are getting ready to get out and move into the ISS. But just one little reminder again that thank you for maybe considering making a small donation to Aerobility that helps us do what we do and share the magic of aviation with the disabled community, genuinely changing lives. And if also I could just indulge you a little while longer, I wanted to give you a date for your diaries. You may have heard about our Armchair Air Show taking place on the afternoon of Saturday, June the 20th, where we are bringing together some of the most amazing aircraft, including a certain space rocket that we heard a little bit about just now, but I wasn't supposed to say that. I'll be in trouble. But we've got the SR-71, we've got the F-22, the F-35, the Spitfire, the Red Arrow, some amazing aircraft from around the world. So it's not just an air show, it's actually time travel too. So we can see some of these iconic aircraft flying and actually hear from the pilots in real time. So what I'd like to do is if you've got one more minute, is just to show you a little teaser demo we recorded with the Red Arrows the other day with our great friend, Squadron Leader Martin Purty, who did a session with another great friend, Lingy, Mike Ling, former of the Reds and now with the Blades Aerobatic team. This is what the guys got up to as a little demo.
Tornado maneuver. Just talk us through what is happening in your cockpit and what's happening in the other cockpits. We're seeing this from whose cockpit now?
This is Red 8's cockpit. So what you'll see is 7 aircraft up the front, led by me in a graceful formation. But now with down the back, you've got Red 8 and Red 9 who are barrel rolling around that formation. And to make it even more technical, we then bend that formation to the left. So now not only are they barrel rolling around in a straight line, but they've got to do it in a bend as well.
So that's Tornado. That's quite a popular crowd maneuver. What goes into the preparation of designing and practicing that maneuver from the outset?
The design of a maneuver like that, and even this, the palm split that we're seeing, take approximately 6 months of hard graft of training, where the guys are flying 3 times a day, 5 days a week. The maneuver itself, trying to fit it into the sequence, knowing that it's going to take a good sort of 90 seconds of the display. I've got to think about the speed that we go into it, how we get to that speed, and then what the next maneuver is going to be after that to allow us to pull up into the second half, some of which you're now seeing with the Jippo brake and the Jippo split and then the goose here. So it's not just about the single maneuvers, it's about how they sequence together and then how that makes up the full graceful 20-minute another display. Popular maneuver, the cork.
Well, there you go, guys. There's a quick insight there about what we're going to do on the 20th. So we look forward to seeing everybody then. Also, at the end of next week, we've got an amazing Inspire-Ability with the author Claire McIntosh, who's the winning author. So it'd be great to hear from her as well. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons. And, yeah, have a great week.
Thanks very much, all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. My pleasure.